Chad, sorry, Chad. Anyway, so a couple of other things I want us to think about. I want us to think about FEMA's working on their risk map. I want us to think about how we help FEMA with graduated risk information, because we all know it's not just a bright line, you're in or you're out. Now, they have certain political constraints, but human beings are so literal that we really need to figure out how we can add some layers of information to these maps to help people understand the context that they're operating with. Maybe we're going to all want to do like Dorman's doing in North Carolina and try and produce an all hazards map, so you can really know how screwed you are. I live in Charleston, so I know how screwed I am. We had a really big earthquake. We've had a couple of really big hurricanes, and my own crew showed me that our elevation maps overstate our elevation by several meters. And since I think I'm at 8 feet, I think I must be in deep trouble. Okay, so real quick, let me wrap it up, because I'm running over. We have to broaden the field of play. There's some people that we need to be playing with. I talked about ecosystem services. I talked about well, I haven't talked about, but CEQ is leading the discussion about principles and guidelines. I think that's very important when we're talking about water resources projects. Getting the Corps to update its principles and guidance is good. Getting all the feds who fund public infrastructure to think about the siting and design of that public infrastructure over the next decade is really critical. I want to give a shout out to the National Floodplain Functions Alliance. Where are you, Fowler? Raise your hand. It's about time. We need to actually get this to be a major movement. At a very high level, build on the work of things like the Federal Interagency Floodplain Management Task Force. I think that's very important. Include natural and beneficial functions within our definitions. The climate things, and not everybody's on the climate train, but the frequency and severity of disasters, now that's a growth business. But if you happen to be on the climate train, the great news is that we're actually talking about these issues. The National Fish, Wildlife, and Plant Climate Adaptation Strategy, which is the world's worst acronym. I call it the Critter Committee. We've actually talked about the importance of putting together funding for green infrastructure, just in the same way that we put together money for gray infrastructure. And in fact, you know, there's a big alliance called Building America's Future that's going to make sure that we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on gray infrastructure over the next decade. They need to be at the same table that we're at. We need to be at the same table with them. Because if they start laying concrete and we're not there helping them to think about exactly where they're laying that concrete and how they're designing that concrete, not only will critters not have room to migrate, but we're not going to do very much for natural functions. And that's really what we have to do. In fact, FEMA and the Corps and some folks from NOAA are actually going to have a little discussion beginning in June to talk about how we begin to look at this marrying of gray and green infrastructure. We're calling it the SAGE initiative, because if you mix gray and green together, you get the color sage. And maybe we might even be smart, too. So I want to call your attention to that. Let me see, is there anything else in here real quickly? Yeah, let's talk about the Presidential Policy Directive number 8 on national preparedness. So Sandra's sitting right in front of me. Sandra Knight, FEMA mitigation, raise your hand. Now, I'm a big fan of mitigation. Too bad DHS isn't. You know, all the money is still about response and recovery. Now, it's important that we do right during response and recovery, because Lord knows we can do some really stupid things in our response and recovery that only exacerbate our vulnerability, but of course we would never do that. But we really have to do something about mitigation, you know, because disaster mitigation is climate adaptation. It's not just smart now, it's smart in 2 and 3 decades from now. So there is some money out there. I think that we can begin to look at one another's, using one another's nickels as we think particularly about flooding issues, both inland flooding and particularly coastal flooding, which happens to be my particular shtick. But if we look at the great inland coast, aka the Mississippi River and its feeding systems, now, the Ohio looks mighty full, but it's not so full as some other parts of the Mississippi system right now. and we look at the coast, we got a lot of people who are at risk, a lot of property, a lot of money at risk. Why is that not a lobbying force? You know, that's a lot of folks who are at exposure, and they're going to have even greater exposure in the future, and they're already feeling the economic pinch. So one of the things we have to do is to get them to understand that if the Dutch could figure out that they need to design with nature, maybe America should too. Thank you.